don't you start by, you're here as a scientist, and you know, all of you are just out there living your lives, promoting these qualities in children, but why do we overlay talk about science in this conversation?
Well, you know, I have, it's interesting, I have to edit my bio because it's actually like almost been 30 years I've been studying this stuff. And I think in part the science is about helping answer some of the questions. And I, just as a little bit of background, I started off as a teacher, an elementary school teacher, and then worked in alternative high school, worked in early childhood care settings. And it was during that time that I began asking a lot of questions to say, well, why is it when I create these positive relationships with students, I actually see them learning more or more interested in school? And I found that when I went back to graduate school that there was a lot of research in science trying to answer just those questions. And so science sometimes helps us answer some questions to figure out how things work so that we can further it and help figure out programs or practices that could be widespread.
And I know that you feel strongly that scientists can only bring a piece of the puzzle to the question of how children become healthy. And so I love your philosophy about that. Tell me about how you see everybody in this room being part of that puzzle.
So I think, you know, and it sort of comes from having started in practice and coming back to the science. And I think the idea is it has to be a collaboration, because scientists might have their own questions and go out there and do their research studies. But to me, so much of the questions that need to be answered come from practice. So I think that this idea of coming from you, I come and do these things, as Maria has said, I'm always trying to be out there as a scientist, coming and talking to people, because in the community and in schools, and even talking with children and talking with youth, because so many kinds of research questions can be sparked and instigated by the kinds of questions that you have, and to actually go and do research studies. And I also have to say, as a parent also of two teenagers, I find that just even at my house sometimes becomes the place to try to answer some scientific questions, you know, with the friends coming over and the kids, and I think it really needs to be a collaboration. And I want to say just another thing that's really changing in the scientific community, and is that it used to be, and it still results, have you ever heard of that sort of phrase, the ivory tower? You know, the scientists up in the ivory tower, and they rarely make their way down. And there is something even about going to graduate school, getting your degrees, that kind of makes you talk in languages that no one else can understand, and that's kind of promoted. But there's really been a shift in recent years that scientists need to find something, we call it knowledge translation. They need to find ways to translate their research findings for practice to lay people. And the medicine has been doing that a long time, right? In health, and you know, how many people know now that exercise is important? You know, and you know, can prevent a lot of things I think about in that realm, but it hasn't happened as much in terms of children's social and emotional development, the science that's happening, or even in education, the research being translated down to people who get to use it, and then those people start asking questions like, well, you said that would work, but it didn't work in this condition, and so we need to go back and do some more science.
Yeah, I think for 30 years probably I've been a television producer, and so my bent is to want to share with others as soon as I learn something. In fact, my dad used to say, I can tell Maria's thinking because her mouth is moving. Because as soon as I'm thinking, I have to process it by talking about it. And so when I started to learn from Kim about all of this vital information about our children, because I have two children who are now 30 and 28, about our children, I thought it's almost unethical that we aren't sharing this information. And so I have put my understanding about how to translate scientific stuff for all of us to work now through the Dalai Lama Center, because there's so much of what you know that would be useful for us. So if we begin by looking at, you know what I'm realizing, we don't have the heart, but the Heart-Mind framework. How many of you have seen the Heart-Mind framework that I'm referring to? Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay. So we will get that. But yeah, there's a heart there. Some posters, yeah. There are 5 positive human qualities that we would promote in children that we refer to as heart-mind well-being.
We got it. Oh, you're going to hold that up for us, Bob?
It's wood. It's wood. You made an even nicer, creative one.
I love that.
That's a nice one, eh? Why did you do it wood?
It's a project.
Oh,
right.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you don't have to tell us. That's it's a surprise for us.
Yes.
These are the words, and Kim will walk us through
Yeah.
it. But just so in my own little mind, that's what I'm thinking about when I'm talking about heart, mind, well-being. Kim may refer to it as social and emotional learning. Thank you very much. But before we start to look at each of those qualities individually, tell us about some of the things, some general concepts or some general principles related to this aspect of our children's development, which is their social development and their emotional development.
So one of the things that's been very fascinating in the past decade, this research area of children's social and emotional development has just exploded. The research and the science behind what we know has just grown exponentially, and there's new scientific discoveries that have come to light that some of you might not be aware of. And I kind of, I could actually go on. I teach graduate courses on this whole topic, so I could go on and on. But I'll just tell you 4 of these recent scientific discoveries that might have impact on how you do things. The first one is through recent technologies and neuroimaging of the brain, we know a lot more about neuroplasticity. And we used to think that the brain, that you developed and you get all these connections in your brain and they kind of were static and then you start losing them and that you can't change. And we now know through neuroplasticity that the brain is malleable, that you can teach these skills at different ages, that you can actually retrain the brain through practice. One of the areas in which I do research is mindfulness or mindfulness practices, and that you could actually at different ages. And one of the things, for example, we used to think that, although we totally know the first couple of years of life are so important in terms of the brain development, we know that the brain continues to develop, particularly this prefrontal cortex region that includes things like planning and emotions, up until age, doesn't even sort of mature until age 25. So I don't know if anybody have like teenagers or say, why can't they make these decisions? Because of these recent innovations in understanding the brain and neurotechnology that allows us to do that. The second one is a whole new area of research called positive psychology. And that really sparked around the year 2000. And what it was is it was something we call a paradigm shift. It used to be for decades we focused on ill-being and a very disease-focused approach where it was, and it's interesting in psychology, it really happened around World War II when research was really growing. When the veterans were returning, a lot of the focus was how do we deal with post-traumatic stress disorder? How do we deal with depression? How do we deal with anxiety? And in around 2000, Marty Seligman and another researcher called Mike Csikszentmihalyi talked about this idea, you know what? We know a lot about ill-being. We know very little about well-being from a positive stance, things like happiness, joy, hope. We know very little about these positive emotions and how to foster them. In the past decade and a half has really been an explosion of research looking at things like happiness, like gratitude, I could tell you quickly. Do you want to know 3 ways to be happy?
Yeah.
The research, and first of all, you should know happy people live longer, have better relationships, have greater job satisfaction, and recover better from injury. And some research by Sonia Lubomirsky and Ed Diener finds that 3 ways we know that you can promote happiness are pretty simple. One is practicing gratitude, doing opportunities to write gratitude journals, writing gratitude letters. There's actually recent research with children practicing gratitude. The second one is savoring happy experiences, to think about times in your life in which you felt very happy and proud and revisiting those experiences to boost, we call it mood induction, where you could actually boost mood. And
how do you revisit them? Like by talking about them, is that enough?
Talking about them, writing about them, even doing a little movie in your mind of sort of going through that. And the third one, which is my favorite, I have to say, is by helping others. We now know that both your physical health as well as your mental health is fostered and promoted, and you become happier when you help others. And so they've been doing research on acts of kindness interventions and getting people to help others. And there's books written on the topic now, but that's one of them. The other The third one that is important is that we now know we have underestimated children's competencies.
How many of you agree with that?
We used to believe two things. One is that children are born aggressive, that children are born aggressive and self-centered, and that we need to kind of tame them and bring them along, to socialize them so they're no longer aggressive. And there's research now showing, which I'll talk about in a minute, that children actually are born, there's some people who argue, born to be good and altruistic and helpful. And that's one dimension of that. And I think the other one is that we always thought that children were incompetent. So how many of you ever heard of Piaget? Jean Piaget, right? Constructivist approach. And Piaget did so much for the field of child development and sort of saying how important a constructivist, a child-centered approach to try and view the lens. But he also talked about these stages of development where children can't see others' perspectives and are basically egocentric. But now there's research showing that even infants can start thinking about others' points of view. And young children can take perspective. So that's the third one. And then the fourth one is discipline. And what the recent science says is how we discipline children. For centuries, very punitive approaches were seen to be important to help children behave. Again, I think it comes from that idea that children need to be tamed and we need to kind of get them to do it. And we now know from the research that inductive approaches to discipline, ones in which, yeah, I'll tell what inductive means, ones in which the parent or the caregiver really talks about getting the child to say, understanding the child's perspective of why that behavior might have occurred and talking with the child about that behavior and getting the child to think about how the other person might be feeling and using a very child-centered approach to help the child internalize this idea that when things happen, you need to think about how your behavior is affecting the other person and what are the ramifications for that. And there's a recent study out actually just in January, I guess just last week, where it showed that mothers' early socialization practices of discipline and using these inductive child-centered approaches actually had implications into adulthood. The children who had these inductive approaches were more likely to be empathic and sympathetic when they were adults if they had parents who practiced these socialization.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking there's sometimes when we have this conversation a thought that this is all about fixing children. You know, making them little automatons. Somebody said, you know, do you want them to be little Buddhas? Is that what you're talking about here? And so I'm conscious of that I'm worried actually sometimes about that's really what the impression that we're leaving. And maybe for a minute you could talk about the fact that this isn't about putting children on the hot seat and molding them into something. This is about us creating contexts that are more likely to result in children being healthy emotionally, happy, and all of those other positive things.
Right, and I think it goes back to this idea of a real child-centered approach and that we need to start with the children and how our lens or mindsets really affect how we interact with children. So if we look at children on the one hand of having the capacity and the ability to behave in a pro-social way, to understand others, then we provide them with experiences to help that surface versus us, you know, so this idea of a child-centered approach that we are creating the context where their strengths, and I have to say my own bias, I don't think it's just my bias, but anyway, that every child, every individual comes into this world with talents and strengths. And our role is really to see how we provide the context in which that can come to the fore. And I think so we don't want them to just follow us, but it's really the lens in which you look at them. You know, a little example is, I just want to say where I learned this. It wasn't from the science actually at all. It was when I was a teacher at an alternative high school for at-risk youth. And I don't know if anyone's worked with those kinds of kids, but you know, it's a bit of a challenge. And when I started working at this school with these children who high school students who had all been kicked out of high schools for various reasons, had a number of problems, they were really nasty to me. They were really nasty to me.
You were a young teacher.
I was a young teacher. I was like 22, 23, and they called me names, and I won't repeat them. And first my feelings were hurt because as a teacher, I wanted them to like me. And I was a brand new teacher. I wanted my students to be enthusiastic. And then when I started looking at it and said, from their lens, I was a teacher it wasn't just Kim, the teacher. They didn't know me yet. I was the teacher who represented people who had had a history that in their lives of making them feel inadequate, and how when I saw that, I could then say, they're actually, by pushing me away and doing that, that's actually very functional. That's their resiliency. And I have to, it's up to me to help get them to see, to surface their strengths and talents rather than them seeing me. Anyway, so I think it's...
yeah, and you taught me there are three kind of ways that I look at it. If the question is asked, how in general do you promote these qualities? One is by creating an environment that is caring and that is safe. The second is relationships. And of course this is, I see nodding heads because this is what you already know. But the third is by actual direct instruction about some skills. There are some social skills and emotional skills that take practice. So as we're walking through each of these 5 positive human qualities, be thinking about those 3 layers. One is, what is the environment that we're creating, period? What does it feel like in this neighborhood house? Does it feel safe and welcoming? What are the relationships we're creating? And the third one is, are there some specific skills that we're teaching children and ourselves to help promote these qualities? So let's begin
I have to go to
by
my
starting
sheet
to
here.
walk through these qualities, because your projects will be promoting the qualities that we're going to be going through now. I hope that Kim's insights help you tweak your projects and enhance your projects. So the first one that we'll look at, the first quality is secure and calm. What does it mean, and what do you know about that?
So secure and calm is really about not having anxiety, being able to approach new situations with not a lot of worries, being able to even have strategies when you do feel anxious. I don't know, have any of you ever felt stress? Okay. And how important it is for children to learn specific skills and tools for helping themselves calm down, helping themselves deal with the worries. And a lot of times it's interesting, we need actually explicit instruction in helping children learn those kinds of activities and things. I know the Friends for Life program is one that helps them. There's the Mind Up program that actually helps kids, or just the breathing, take a breath. There's another program called Paths that it uses a turtle technique where you stop, just do some breaths and think. But the one thing I wanted to mention about this, so there are a lot of very explicit strategies that children can be taught that aren't necessarily a natural tendency. But the one thing I wanted to mention is some of the recent science which has been talking about something called a stress contagion. That we now know that stress is contagious. If you think about the idea of yawning, has anyone ever seen yawns are contagious? Well, guess what? Stress, when you are around other people, even if you do not have stresses in your life, you become more stressed. It affects you physiologically by being around that. Now think about young children in situations, in families, or in contexts which there is a lot of stress. So even though that child might not have stress in their own, that environment or their parents' stress seeps into them. It's contagious. So the idea of really helping children, and again, I think about children who are in environments where parents are stressed because of money, because of workload, because of having to deal with multiple things, that stuff seeps into children. And we find that now a lot of children have more anxiety. And there's a lot more, I don't know, I'm just wondering, for you, all of you and children you work with, do you find that children have more stresses in their life, or seem more anxious, or seem more worried? And so what that means is we need to give them the tools to deal with that. And I have to just say an aside, just because I've been doing research on looking at mindfulness, and we've been doing things in schools, it's so fascinating to me, 2 things. One is the kids say, finally, you're teaching us something that's useful. Because it's like, we could see we use that. And the other thing is the number of children who learn these skills and go and teach them to their parents. That is fascinating to me. So, often we think the parents teach the children, but sometimes you could get the children to teach the parents. It's just a different way of looking at that.
The other thing that says to me, because I know there are a lot of, well, probably almost all of you are parents in this room, that says to me, take care of myself as a parent, because I'm a contagion, potentially a contagion. So, and if I'm supporting any parents in any way, just love them. Just make sure that they feel secure and calm so that they're not a negative contagion. Well, but you can be a positive contagion.
You can, and there's a happiness contagion as well. I have to give the other counter, is that happiness and positive mood is actually also contagious.
Yeah.
And all of you will probably be, you know, have you ever been laughing with friends? And it just is infectious, you know, and it's contagious. And so we have to think about that. But Maria brings it something, and I don't know if we'll really get to go into any depth, but the idea is that what the research is really showing, that if you want to promote children's social and emotional health and well-being, or heart-mind, you really need to start with the adults and their own well-being, and how important it is to take care of the adults. We often feel like we want to teach the children and get the adults to teach the skills to the children, when in fact how important it is to start with the adults and getting them to think about their own strategies and then think about the children. Anyway, so I just think it's a critical
who you are.
one.
Yeah. So leaving here today, you'll be so happy. You'll be the happy contagions. Okay, so the second one you were going to look at is gets along with others.
Right, and so this is about getting along with peers and adults and being able to negotiate things. And what the research, and again, I'm just, and you didn't bring up, so I was just going to say the human Google. So I just have to say, I love the research. I teach courses, and I, like, for fun, I just go and Google things and read the recent research articles, and, well, not just for fun, because I do so much research study, but I just, you know, there's a part of me, I could talk here for hours and tell you, oh, and there's this cool study that just came out, but I'm going to try and control myself. But
She is a human Google. That's what I've coined the phrase.
She has. Maria has talked about that. But one, you know, I tried to think about what is sort of a study. One is about, we find that children's early peer relationships are one of the most important predictors of later psychosocial adjustment. How you get along with adults is often forecasted or predicted from your early peer relationships. And there's two dimensions of peer relationships you need to think about: how accepted you are by your peer group, how much other children invite you to play in, and how much they see you as someone who isn't going to start fights or behave aggressively. And the second one is having one close friendship. Having a close friend with whom you can confide, and it even becomes more important as children develop, but even young children, to have that one really good friend that could be fostered. And what the research, it's very interesting, the one study that kind of is sticky for me is one that showed that children who begin kindergarten with one other child that they know in their classroom, they are better adjusted midway through the year, they have more friends, and by the end of the year have higher school achievement, just by beginning the kindergarten with one other person. And if you think about it, any of you in a new stressful situation, a transition, which we know are stress pileups and really times of vulnerability in terms of windows, but also windows of opportunity, that even thinking about when you walk into a room and you don't know anyone, and then all of a sudden you see that one person you know, and you go with that person, and you can think about this child in kindergarten who sees their buddy, and then that person, they together go and explore this new environment and invite new children in. And it's such a simple, like, I really would love it mandatory that, number one, that when parents are starting, it could be even preschool, that you think about the list beforehand, and before the kindergarten year sort of identify the notion that they could have play dates with kids before they start kindergarten, so that when they start kindergarten, they already know some of the children. It just is another important aspect.
And I love that you said the one friend is enough, because not every child has a different temperament.
Yes.
And they're not all going to have tons of friends they play with all the time. If you have one person who you consider your friend, that's also protective for them.
Right, and they actually, the research finds that in looking at terms of being accepted by the peer group versus having the one close friend, having the one close friend, it actually buffers if you're not accepted by your peer group, but you have that one close friend. So let's say in your classroom, you're not so much a part of the classroom, but you have that one neighbor who goes to a different school. That's a buffer for the negative effects.
That's interesting. All right, compassionate and kind, that's your area.
Oh, I can go on forever. Anyways, I won't. The thing, and I sort of foreshadowed it a bit, is that what we know now is that children, we've underestimated them greatly in their ability to be compassionate and kind. And there's some work by Felix Wernicken, and I'd really, actually one thing is to go to the Dalai Lama Center website and watch Felix's presentation at Heart-Mind 2014 and see this work. But basically what Felix did, he started to do some research with toddlers, with 18-month-olds. And he set up a situation where seeing if this 18-month-old would help someone they don't know. So the idea would be that children are egocentric, they can't see. So it's basically set up a situation where there's an adult the child does not know, needs some help. One is holding up, putting up clothespins, and one of the clothespins drops, to see whether that 18-month-old would help. And they found consistently across different situations that 18-month-olds will help without any expectation of reward. Now think about the complexity of that task. The toddler is sitting in a corner with his or her mom or over there. They have to figure out what happened, what that person, they have to take the person's perspective to figure out what that person needs to help, and then to actually go and physically carry out that
Without
activity.
any prodding.
Without any prodding, and they did it actually with parents prodding and no parents, and they even did it when the adults weren't even paying attention to the child helping, and found consistently that children will help. They'll behave in a altruistic, what we call altruism is basically helping another person without any expectation of reward.
So what are the implications of that?
Well, the implications of that are twofold. One is, well, the other study found that what happened when you started rewarding the child when they helped, when you gave them a little toy. And they did a study where they set it up so that one group of toddlers, well, it was 2-year-olds, basically when they helped, they got a reward. They got a little toy. One group got a thank you very much, that was so helpful, and another group got nothing. That the children who got the reward actually stopped helping. That the extrinsic reward actually undermined the altruistic activities, and it's something we call, anyways, it's basically that something happens when you get a reward for something that actually naturally feels good. Remember before I said that when we help others, we become happier? Well, then it suddenly gets focused on the concrete object. So the implications for that are, if you want children to be compassionate, kind, don't start doing these whole reward systems and sticker systems.
Allowance?
Allowance. Very interesting as a parent. When I read this research, I have to say my boys, Griffin and Gray, who are 14 and 18 now, they really sometimes don't like that I know so much of the science. And this is one case of it where the research really shows that paying for household chores undermines the development of empathy. That children who just do regular household chores, bring your dishes to the sink, making your bed, bring your laundry down, that those children who don't get paid are more likely to develop concern for others because they're part of a family group that just is, we all pitch in, we all have a role, we all care for each other, and it isn't just all about me, 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 and materialism.
And even the thank you, it's not an overly, thank you, you're so amazing, come and see him, isn't he amazing? It's a thank you that's just...
Well, actually, you know, the research really says the thank you, just acknowledging it, and that it should be very specific about the actual task. Instead of the good job, which we kind of overuse, it'd be like, you know, that was so helpful. I saw how you went and you carried that, and you carried these things for me that really helped me. So I think really giving specific information about what the helpful act was, and just as another kind of piece of that, it's not written down in here, but I was just thinking, the other research that's really showing that when you help children develop an identity of themselves being a helpful person, so instead of saying things like, that was so good the way you behaved, saying, you know what, you're really a kind, helpful person. I know that about you. And even when they behave in a way that you don't want them to acknowledge and say, you know, I know that you usually behave in a helpful way, and so I'm kind of puzzled now of why you did that. And so instead of saying you're a bad child, really using that context of their and helping them, then they internalize that identity of being a kind and helpful person.
Great. All right, so the next one is alert and engaged?
Yes, so alert and engaged is another area that particularly the neuroscience has really sparked a lot of research on this notion of something called self-regulation. How many of you have heard the term self-regulation, self-control, executive function? And the research has really been showing how important being able to have self-control, to delay gratification. So have any of you seen the marshmallow Right, it's great. If you haven't seen it, you should see that. It's so fascinating. It's so funny. They put a marshmallow to see for young children of how much they can delay gratification and not eat the marshmallow. And what they're finding is that ability to self-control, to have that, inhibit that natural tendency that might be to eat the marshmallow, to, I don't know, to bop another child when you want the Lego, to
wait in line, to wait your turn.
All of those things, two things. One is that they're important for later adjustment, and two, that they can be taught. And I think that's, again, going back to the idea of the neuroplasticity, that these can be taught. And even games, it's so funny now thinking about games and things like red light, green light, and all of these kinds of activities that are about learning to wait, Simon Says, and are ones that help develop this prefrontal cortex, which is the executive control of these. But I wanted to mention one other thing, two things. One is there's a longitudinal study by Terry Moffat and others that looked at 1,000 children from birth to 30 years of age. And they looked at all of the factors that predicted at 30, things like managing your finances, to criminal activity, to mental health. And they found the single best predictor was in middle childhood, across multiple dimensions, was self-control into age 30. So it's very interesting.
So this isn't obedience, this isn't compliance, this is inside they are in control themselves.
Right, and being able to inhibit sort of impulse control. It's all of those kinds of things. But it's actually so related, what we know from the science is it's so much related to these prefrontal cortex control facilities. But the one last thing I want to say that was a very fascinating study, you looked at this marshmallow experiment to see how the self-control could be promoted, but then they decided to do an experiment. This is where the science gets so interesting. To do an experiment where you put children in variable, inconsistent environments, so that they didn't know that they would actually get the marshmallow if they delayed gratification. And what they found was that children previously who could have that self-control in those variable contexts did not.
In the chaotic kind of
more chaotic. So the idea that somehow it's just something within the child to talk about how much the context plays a role. And if you think about children who are growing up in inconsistent environments where if you don't eat it now, you're not going to get it later, that it's functional to actually not have that self-control, because I just want to emphasize, so it's not about something that you just kind of change the brain of the child and then they have it, that there's something about the context interaction with that.
I just wanted to make a point about that. The Dalai Lama Center has a fabulous resource called Heart-Mind Online, and the posters that are here, you'll see the URL about how to go there. But one of the pieces on Heart-Mind Online is Adele Diamond, who's a world-renowned brain expert. And so she would talk about this executive function, how your brain develops in early childhood. There's a piece on Heart-Mind Online of Adele talking about really how do you develop that part of your brain. And her message is so clear. What she says is listen to children. And she does a beautiful piece because she's not saying you have to go in and do brain anything. You don't have to go directly to their brain. You listen to children and you're wholeheartedly present when children are talking. And to think of how good that feels to you and to them, and to know that at the same time you're promoting this development of the part of the brain that will result in this ability to have self-control and have impacts for the rest of their life. I think that's a wonderful.
It is important, and I just want to say Adele also has some great articles about the activities in which you can do, including dance and music and things like taekwondo and circus and things like that actually help develop these prefrontal cortex skills. So again, thinking about what I identify as the mechanism. So it isn't just by providing the experience, you have to understand what is it about the experience that is helping internalize some of these.
So we have just a few minutes left, and let's do solves problems peacefully, because especially now that's an important one.
Right, so the solves problems peacefully, again, sort of going back to this notion that children can have opportunities to learn how to negotiate relationships with others. I do want to make really important that this idea of being able to solve problems peacefully not only has implications for how children get along in daycare settings or at home with their siblings, but also for the world. Like, think about, we want young children to have these skills so that when they go out into the world and have to deal with learning to take others' perspectives, learning to solve problems in a way that's non-conflictual is so critical, and how each of us plays such a role, because we have an opportunity, because it's in this moment where children are not getting along. I don't know if any of you have siblings who argue. And seeing that instead of as an opportunity to send one to the room and one to wherever, is saying, okay, how are we going to work on this together? How are we going to solve this? Looking at that as an opportunity where that's happening, to think about others' perspectives. And I'm just going to give one last example, just because it's one which I, again, learned from all of you. So Griffin, who was 3 years old, he was going to one of the VSOC childcare programs down near Urban Fair. And I walked in one day, and they took me aside, the early childhood educators took me aside and said, Kim, there was an incident today with Griffin. And at first I'm like, oh no. And he scratched one of his friend's faces.
How old was he at the time?
3. He was 3 years old. And they said, and I'm like, oh no. So first I think, oh my goodness, I study empathy. And what's my child doing? And then second, I better cut his nails. I don't know if anybody has 3-year-olds. You have to be on top of those nails.
It's all about you, Kim.
I know. So it's like I should. Anyway, so I said, "Oh, do I need to do anything?" I was kind of, a bit upset. She goes, "No, we took care of it. I just wanted you to be aware of it." And I said, "Well, what happened?" And she said, "Well, he and his friend were playing, and I think it was like playing with Duplo or Lego. And Griffin wanted something. His friend wouldn't give it to him, and he went to go grab it, and he scratched his friend's face. And then his friend was crying, and then Griffin was upset." And they went there, the early childhood educator came and said, okay, you guys, Griffin, how do you think your friend is feeling right now? And, he says, sad. And then they together thought, Griffin, what can you do to help your friend feel better? And they sort of talked about it, and they came up, I don't remember who came up with the idea of getting a cold washcloth and holding it on the friend's face where the scratch was. So Griffin and the early childhood educator went over to the sink, got the washcloth, ran it under the cold water, make sure it was wrung out, and then they took 2 little chairs facing each other, and Griffin then sat in this one and held the cold washcloth on his friend's face till he felt better, and then they went off and played. Now think about it. It's called restorative practices, by the way, or restitution, or however you want. Think of how we typically deal with that situation, or maybe not typically. Maybe the default sometimes is, Griffin, you're in the timeout. Go and sit in the corner. You can't be. And the friend, here, you can have all the Duplo or whatever. Instead of using it as an opportunity to learn a situation. So what we find from the research, when parents or caregivers provide those opportunities where children get to think about the other person's perspective, think about what could they do next time, think about how they could help restore it, actually helps them later on in life internalize that. So they no longer need to have the adult there fixing it. They actually learn to do it for themselves, and how important it is early on.
Well, thank you, Kim, for those words of wisdom. And I must say, we see all of you at your tables as a candy store for us, because we know that now that Kim's just given a little taste of what research exists, that actually what you're going to do now is take these 5 positive human qualities, or one of the qualities, and you're going to tell us what inspires you about these qualities. What is your theory or hypothesis about why your project might promote those qualities? And so we are so fortunate to be able to watch you now with your creativity and your vast knowledge and experience to do that very thing. Kim's going to stay around all day, and so am I. And what we'll be able to do, especially Kim, is just kind of listen in and answer any questions. If you're wondering in your project, what would the active ingredient be here? What is the thing we should be doing a little bit more of to promote one of these qualities? But for now, I'd just like you to join me in thanking Kim Schonert-Reichel for your presentation.